Order. On Monday, the 17th of March, I informed the House that there would today be an opportunity for honourable and right honourable members to pay tribute to the Right Honourable Tony Benn.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today we've had the chance to pay tribute to the life and work of Tony Benn, one of the greatest MPs and certainly one of the greatest orators of his generation. And I think he would have been gratified that Parliament has had this chance to recall his long involvement in our national political life in this way, despite the fact that he was neither a head of state nor royalty. He did, however, serve in this place with a couple of unintended interruptions for over 50 years and was granted the freedom of the Commons when he retired as an MP. With Tony Benn, as we've heard over and over today, you never got doubt or ambiguity. We've had many moving anecdotes and tributes to him today. Many of them have pointed out that he had strong views and more talent than most for getting them across to his audience, either from a platform or in a book. He was passionate, and he was a lifelong socialist who never lost his appetite for the battle, even though he waged it in distinctly different phases during his long and fulfilled life. He was an assiduous backbencher, the first to table a motion against apartheid. And, Mr. Speaker, I last heard him speak during the remembrance service held in Westminster Hall at your suggestion for Nelson Mandela. He opposed capital punishment. He championed human rights long before it was fashionable to do so, introducing his own human rights bill in 1957. He championed divorce laws, though he enjoyed a 50-year marriage to his beloved wife Caroline, who was a formidable campaigner, I can attest to, in her own right. He was the Peter Mandelson of his day, demanding that Labour modernise its communication strategies, especially where television was concerned, although it's fair to say, Mr. Speaker, that his political journey took him in a slightly different direction thereafter. He served as a junior minister, and when he was Postmaster General, where as a Republican, he tried and failed to get rid of the Queen's head, but he did manage to shrink it down to a much smaller size. As Technology Minister, he oversaw the development of Concorde, but I think he tired of the constraints of ministerial office, and instead he decided he must range wider to change the political terms of trade by sheer rhetorical force. And as we've heard today, he had plenty of sheer rhetorical force. And it was for doing this that he came to be regarded by the media as the most dangerous man in Britain. First and foremost, though, he revered the House of Commons as the crucible of our democracy, and we have heard that over and over again in today's tributes. The place, he said, where kings and tyrants could be tamed and revolution averted. This was in contrast to the House of Lords, which he described as the British Outer Mongolia for retired politicians. Its solution to most problems was more accountability and more democracy, which, let's face it, is never a bad place to start. He fought a determined campaign to be allowed to renounce the peerage he'd reluctantly inherited upon the death of his father in 1960, and it was this sad circumstance which threw him out of the Commons for the first time. His ultimate success in renouncing his hereditary peerage had at least one unintended consequence. The Peerages Act 1963 allowed him to return to the Commons. It also allowed Sir Alec Douglas-Home to renounce his peerage so he could mysteriously emerge as leader of the Conservative Party and succeed Macmillan as Prime Minister, much to the chagrin of Rab Butler, who many still believe was robbed of the premiership in this dubious way. Such was the fuss that the Conservative tradition of allowing leaders to emerge without any obvious voting by anyone had to be abandoned. Tony Benn was subsequently to lead another successful campaign to extend the franchise of Labour leadership elections beyond the Parliamentary Labour Party, which was to culminate in the creation of the Electoral College at the Wembley Special Conference in 1981. He lived long enough to see the Labour leadership election franchise extended further to one member, one vote at the special conference which I chaired in March of this year. So, Mr. Speaker, it's possible to argue that it was campaigning by Tony Benn which caused the methods of electing the leaders of both the Tory and the Labour Party to be reformed, and in both cases it was to move them in a more democratic direction. Of course, his determined opposition to Britain's membership of what was then called the Common Market helped to give us our first referendum, too. He was a mesmerising speaker in any context, in the Commons, on a platform, latterly on a theatre stage, or in the left-field tent at Glastonbury. He followed in the footsteps of the Levellers and the Chartists. He was a true English radical, evangelising, teaching and persuading generations of left activists about the power and potential of politics to change things for the better. Even when he was making a case with which I didn't agree, I marvelled at his formidable communication skills. He had a way of making complex ideas seem simple, and a memorable turn of phrase ensured that his observations stayed with you long after the meeting had ended. He revelled in social progress. I remember talking to him 20 years ago about the ordination of women into the Anglican priesthood. He'd been down specially to watch the first women vicars being ordained and was delighted at the joyful occasion he had witnessed, and he was aware of its significance in the battle for women's equality. I remember as a young activist going to campaign in the Chesterfield by-election in 1984, in which Tony was seeking to return to the Commons for the second time. My sister, the Honourable Member for Garston and Halewood, and I went over to help with a contingent which included Alan Roberts, the then member for Bootle. Things were looking a bit wobbly, and the stakes were high, and we were sent off to try and remove from a tower block strategically placed on the main road into the town a forest of Liberal posters which had suddenly appeared, causing much consternation in the campaign HQ. My sister discovered that the posters were down to a disgruntled Labour voter who'd decided to switch sides. Get that Tony Benn down here if you want me to change my mind, she'd demanded. By coincidence, we bumped into him a few minutes later, and so my sister carted him off to the woman's front door. She invited him in, and he reached over to an old photograph she had on her mantelpiece. It was a group shot of Labour politicians, and he named every single one of them in the photograph, except one, which he correctly surmised was her husband, an ex-local Labour councillor. She was utterly charmed. The Liberal posters all came down and were replaced with Labour ones. The tide turned, and it was said that in the Labour Club that weekend, my honourable friend, the member for Bolsover, started singing again. Mr. Speaker, the leader of the Labour Party has paid a fulsome tribute to Tony Benn. He leaves behind many memories, his fascinating and honest diaries, a legacy of which we've heard some today, but most of all his devoted children, Stephen, Hilary, Melissa and Joshua, to whom we extend our sincere condolences. I believe the tributes that we have heard today do great service to the memory of a great man who lived a long and fulfilled life. May he rest in peace.
The Leader of the House.